Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Carl Watts. Carl Watts, also known as Coral Eugene Watts, was an American serial killer who operated in the 1970s and 1980s. Born in Killeen, Texas, Watts was a quiet and unassuming individual who led a double life as a cold-blooded killer. Watts targeted and killed numerous women, primarily in Texas and Michigan. His victims were often young women, and he would stalk them before attacking. Watts' crimes were characterized by their brutality and the lack of a discernible pattern, making it challenging for law enforcement to connect the cases. Despite his significant number of victims, Watts managed to evade capture for several years, partly due to his ability to blend into society and avoid suspicion. However, his luck ran out in 1982 when he was apprehended for burglary as well as an attempted killing. During questioning, he ended up confessing to multiple crimes, providing details that linked him to numerous unsolved cases. Watts eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts and received a lengthy prison sentence. His cooperation with authorities allowed them to close several cold cases and bring closure to the families of his victims. Watts died of prostate cancer while serving his sentence on September 21, 2007. Despite not achieving the same level of media coverage as some other infamous serial killers, Watts' actions left a trail of devastation and loss in the communities he targeted. In our number 9 spot today, we have Johann Unterweger. Johann was an Austrian serial killer who terrorized Vienna in the 1990s. Johann's criminal activities first gained attention in the late 1970s when he was convicted for taking the life of a young woman and sentenced to life in prison. However, during his incarceration, he managed to project a very reformed image, becoming an accomplished writer and gaining support from intellectuals who believed he had been rehabilitated. Due to his literary talent and the perception of his redemption in A Great Miscarriage of Justice, he was released on parole in 1990 after serving only 15 years of his life sentence. He soon became a media personality, presenting himself as a rehabilitated ex-convict and a crusader for the rights of prisoners. He even worked as a journalist and wrote articles on crime and rehabilitation, further enhancing his public image. However, beneath his charismatic persona, he harbored a dark and violent side. He began to commit heinous crimes again, committing a series of brutal killings that mirrored the style of his previous ones. Despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, Johann managed to evade suspicion for some time. He capitalized on his media connections to shape public opinion and divert attention from himself. However, his luck ran out when evidence linking him to the crimes started to mount. In 1992, he was arrested in Miami, Florida after being tracked down by Austrian and American authorities. He was extradited to Austria to stand trial for the killings of 11 women. The high-profile trial captivated the nation and received significant media coverage within Austria. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and his own confessions. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On June 29, 1994, Johann was found deceased in his prison cell, and it was later determined that he had taken his own life. In our number 8 spot today, we have Anthony Sowell. Anthony Sowell was a notorious serial killer whose crimes shocked the city of Cleveland, Ohio from 2007 to 2009. Born on August 19, 1959 in East Cleveland, Sowell's criminal activities targeted vulnerable women, specifically those struggling with addiction and those involved in sex work. Sowell's crimes took place in and around his residence on Imperial Avenue, a seemingly ordinary house that hid a horrifying secret. He would lure his victims to his home under the pretense of offering them something to feed their addictions or shelter. Once inside, his horrifying crimes would unfold. The bodies of his victims were often hidden throughout the house, concealed in various locations, including crawl spaces and buried in the backyard. While these crimes were taking place, the local community was largely unaware of the extent of the crimes occurring in their midst. The victims, many of whom were marginalized and leading transient lives, were often overlooked by society. In October 2009, a courageous survivor managed to escape from Sowell's house and alerted the authorities. When the police executed a search warrant on Sowell's property, they made the horrifying discovery of decomposing bodies, leading to his immediate arrest. The case of Anthony Sowell garnered significant attention within the Cleveland community, where the shock and horror of the crimes reverberated. Local media covered the story extensively, focusing on the heinous nature of the crimes and the impact on the victims' families. However, the case did not receive as much national or international coverage as some other high-profile serial killer cases. During Sowell's trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case against him, supported by physical physical evidence, DNA matches, and the testimonies of survivors. In 2011, he was found guilty on 82 counts and was sentenced to death. In our number 7 spot today, we have Maury Travis. Maury Travis was an American serial killer who terrorized the St. Louis, Missouri area in the early 2000s. His heinous crimes targeted several women, and he infamously recorded some of the crimes on videotape. In the early 2000s, Travis began a spree of violence that would claim the lives of multiple women, leaving a community on edge and law enforcement agencies frantically searching for answers. It is said that Travis would often lure the young women he targeted either to secluded areas or sometimes even to his own home. Despite the gravity of his actions, Maury Travis' case did not attract widespread media attention beyond the local region. However, the local community was acutely aware of the terror that Travis had unleashed upon their city. Law enforcement agencies diligently investigated the killings, piecing together evidence and connecting the dots to build a case against him. Ultimately, it was the discovery of Travis's collection of graphic and disturbing videos that provided critical evidence linking him to the crimes. On June 30th, 2002, faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Maury Travis took his own life in his jail cell. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in St. Louis's history, but the scars left by his actions remained. Although Maury Travis's case did not receive extensive media coverage outside of the local region, the impact of his crimes on the St. Louis community cannot be understated. In our number 6 spot today, we have Kendall Francois. Kendall Francois was an American serial killer whose horrific crimes unfolded in the quiet city of Poughkeepsie, New York during the 1990s. Born on July 26, 1971, Francois led a double life, hiding a dark and sinister secret behind his seemingly ordinary facade. Francois specifically targeted women, and he would lure them to his home where he subjected them to unspeakable acts of violence and ultimately took their lives. Shockingly, he managed to conceal his crimes by hiding the bodies of his victims within his residence, creating a haunting and gruesome secret that remained undiscovered for an extended period. Despite the disturbing nature of his crimes, Kendall Francois' case did not receive significant media attention at the time. The lack of widespread coverage was due in part to the marginalized nature of his victims. This made it easier for their disappearances to go unnoticed by the broader public. The true extent of his crimes only came to light in 1998 when a routine visit from police officers, prompted by a complaint about a foul odor, led to the shocking discovery of multiple decomposing bodies hidden throughout his home. In total, the remains of 8 women were found, exposing the gruesome reality of his actions. Kendall Francois was subsequently arrested, and during his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed. In 2000, he was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Kendall Francois' case did not receive the same level of national or international media attention as some other high-profile serial killer cases, it serves as a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary communities. In our number 5 spot today, we have Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was a Norwegian-American serial killer who is believed to have killed over 40 people, including her own family, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Belle was born in Norway in 1859 and immigrated to the United States in 1881. She settled in Chicago, where she married her first husband and started a family. This was all fine and well until things soon took a turn. Belle began to collect life insurance policies on her family members, and if you're a true crime fan, you likely know where this is going. She then went on to eventually kill them in a fire. She then moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she purchased a farm and continued to lure wealthy suitors to her property just to then kill them for their money and assets. She was known for her physical strength and was able to bury her victims' bodies on her property. Belle's crimes were discovered in 1908 when a fire destroyed her farm and the remains of several of her victims were found. We love when the villain is brought to justice, but unfortunately that did not happen here. Belle herself was never found, and it is believed that she may have faked her own death and fled the country. In our number 4 spot today, we have Charles Schmid. Charles Schmid, infamously known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, was a figure of terror during the 1960s for his involvement in a string of brutal crimes that shook the city of Tucson, Arizona. Operating between 1964 and 1965, Schmid's first victim, Aline Rowe, disappeared in the fall of 1964. Her disappearance sparked concern among her family and friends, but initially received limited attention from the media. As time went on, his violent tendencies escalated and his list of victims grew. The case gained some attention locally due to the disappearances and the growing sense of unease in Tucson. People were disturbed by the disappearances and the realization that a predator was lurking in in their midst. It wasn't until one of Schmid's acquaintances came forward with crucial information that law enforcement finally uncovered the extent of his crimes. In 1965, he was arrested and charged with the killings of Aline Rowe, Gretchen Fritz, and Wendy Fritz. The revelation of his dark secrets shocked the community and brought the nation's attention to the grisly acts committed by the Pied Piper of Tucson. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were exposed, with witnesses testifying to his manipulation, his disregard for human life, and the chilling pleasure he derived from his actions. The case captivated the local media, but it did not achieve the same level of national media coverage as some of the era's more high-profile cases, such as the Manson family. Charles Schmid was found guilty of the killings and sentenced to death. However, in 1972, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment when the death penalty was briefly abolished in the United States. Schmid spent the rest of his life behind bars, becoming a haunting reminder of the evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Albright. Charles Albright, famously known as the Eyeball Killer, was a convicted serial killer whose heinous crimes unfolded in Dallas, Texas during the 1990s. Born on August 10, 1933, Albright appeared to lead a relatively normal life. He grew up in a middle-class family, received a good education, and pursued a career in the field of ophthalmology. His chosen profession, specializing in eye care, added a very eerie twist to his later crimes. The hallmark of his crimes was the removal of his victims' eyes, leading to his chilling moniker, the Eyeball Killer. This disturbing signature left a lasting impression on the local community, instilling fear and disbelief in the hearts of those who heard of his deeds. However, this case did not capture the same level of national or even international attention as some other notorious killers of the time. In 1991, Albright's reign of terror came to an end when he was arrested and charged with taking the lives of 3 women, Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, and Shirley Williams. Albright was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and he remained incarcerated until his death in 2020. In our number 2 spot today, we have Gary Ray Bowles. Gary Ray Bowles, widely known as the I-95 Killer, was an American serial killer who terrorized the southeastern United States during the early 1990s. His specific targeting of gay men along the Interstate 95 corridor left a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. Despite the gravity of his crimes, Bowles' case did not garner the same level of attention as some other notorious killers of the era. He began his killing spree in March of 1994, spanning over an intense 8-month period. His MO involved targeting vulnerable gay men, often befriending them and gaining their trust before subjecting them to his crimes. This spree would go on to leave a trail of tragedy and heartbreak in multiple states along the I-95 corridor. Bowles' criminal activities finally came to an end in November of 1994 when he was apprehended in Florida. He was subsequently charged with multiple killings, and his capture provided a sense of relief and closure to the affected communities. However, the media attention surrounding his arrest and subsequent trial remained relatively contained. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed, shedding light on the extent of his violence and the tragic loss of innocent lives. Gary Ray Bowles was convicted for 6 killings and received multiple death sentences. He spent years on death row, and his case brought attention to the flaws and complexities of the criminal justice system. In 2019, he died of natural causes while awaiting execution, closing a very dark chapter in the history of serial killers in America. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. Cleophas Prince Jr., commonly known as the Claremont Killer, was an American serial killer who operated in the Claremont neighborhood of San Diego, California during the 1990s. Between January and September 1990, Prince embarked on a violent spree targeting and taking the lives of women in the area. Prince would break into their homes or lure them to secluded areas, and while the case did receive attention from local media outlets, the national and international coverage remained relatively limited. Several factors could explain the lack of widespread attention. During the same period, other high-profile serial killer cases, such as those of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, dominated the media landscape, diverting attention away from the Cleophas Prince Jr.'s crimes. Additionally, the demographic profile of Prince's victims may have played a role in the limited coverage. It wasn't until September 1990, after an exhaustive investigation and the implementation of advanced forensic techniques, that Cleophas was finally identified as the Claremont Killer. He was arrested and subsequently convicted, ultimately receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Starting us off at number 10 is Thomas Comberger. In June of 2022, Thomas Comberger, who was reportedly locked away on drug drug charges, escaped the Star Community Justice Center along with 3 other inmates, and has not been found since. But according to the sheriff on the case, the escapees had some help on the outside in order to execute their plan. One of the other inmates, Jeffrey Fields, was engaged to a woman named Allie Angelo, and it is believed that she, along with her ex-husband, visited the center during the inmates' recreational time and snuck in wire cutters to help the 4 men, one of whom was her fiance, escape. Apparently when the cops first arrived at the prison after they got news of the escape, they ran into Allie and asked her if she had witnessed anything, but of course she lied and said no. However, later, after realizing she had matched a description given by an employee, she was detained. Now thankfully 3 of the 4 men were caught pretty shortly after the incident and sent back to the facility, but Thomas remains at large and is still very much a concern. Coming in at number 9, the flat tire killer. Active between 1975 to 1976, this monster is believed to be responsible for between 12 to 35 deaths, though the exact number is still unknown. The perpetrator got his name as allegedly he would offer to help women traveling alone who had gotten a flat tire. But unbeknownst to them, it was the attacker who had deflated their tires in the first place. While not all victims followed the same formula, it was certainly the method for his first 2. Bodies of the victims were often found dumped into canals, while their cars were found abandoned miles away. Authorities believe the cause of most of the deaths to have been from drowning, and disgustingly, all were found with signs of being taken advantage of prior to their death as well. Over the years, with no culprits being found for these vicious attacks, some have suggested it could have been the work of the notorious Ted Bundy, but it's merely a theory and has no evidence to back it up. For all we know, the flat tire killer remains on the loose. Coming in at number 8, the Frankfurt Slasher. Between 1985 to 1990, this monster was known to prey upon women in and around Philadelphia. Now, I know Philadelphia is not in Ohio, but as this killer is unidentified, many think he could be responsible for other crimes done in neighboring states. The Frankfurt Slasher was known for being incredibly violent, mutilating his victims' bodies past recognition. What was designed to be on the inside of the body, like organs and muscle tissue, would often end up exposed, and then after having his way with the victims, he would leave them on the street, strategically posed for when the police would find them. Believed to be responsible for the death of 9 women, the Frankfurt Slasher targeted specifically white women, usually escorts or women with public history of mental illness, but oddly the age of his victims ranged from 28 to 68. One man, Leonard Christopher, was convicted of one of the crimes in 1990, but more happened once he was put away, causing concern that they had found the wrong man. Further significant questions have popped up regarding the quality of evidence used to convict Christopher. He apparently did not match witness reports of the white man seen with other victims, leaving many in fear that the Frankfurt Slasher remains uncaught and unidentified. Next up at number 7, the Colonial Parkway Killer. An active criminal between 1986 to 1989, this person specifically targeted couples traveling the Eastern Scenic Parkway late at night. During that time, 3 couples were found dead and 1 couple went missing, but it is presumed that they had the same fate. A different couple was found each year, leading authorities to question, was this person only killing once a year, or were those just the ones they found? The cases have received major media coverage, including documentaries, news articles, and TV shows as recent as 2021. But despite having over 130 suspects, the FBI have yet to be able to put a name or face to the crimes. One bizarre piece to the puzzle is that in 2010, a note was discovered in a box taken years earlier from one of the victims' apartments. The note stated she was to meet someone in a blue van at a rest stop, and when state police were asked about this, they claimed that the note had been previously examined. But in 1989, during the time of the crimes, an investigator involved with the case told reporters he was unaware of the existence of the note. To this day, whoever was committing these crimes was never caught and they remain on the run. Coming in at number 6, Dr. No. A lesser known but still just as terrifying criminal is the unidentified killer known under aliases such as Stargazer, Dragon, and Dr. No, and who is thought to be responsible for the death of at least 9, but likely more Ohio women between 1981 to 1990. While it's been several years since a confirmed attack by Dr. No, during his active years, this monster is thought to have been a truck driver who would lure in escorts over the radio, have his way with them, and then kill them, leaving their lifeless bodies in the ditch on the side of the road. Because of this, it took a while for authorities to even connect the crimes, as bodies were being found in many different, seemingly unconnected places. Terrifyingly, whoever is responsible for these brutal crimes has yet to be found, but hopefully authorities are able to track down this monster sooner rather than later. Coming in at number 5, Michael and Sharon Gravel. Prior to 2003, adoptive parents Michael and Sharon Gravel appeared to be a wholesome family. Over the years, they adopted 11 young special needs people, homeschooled them, and from the outside, everything seemed totally normal. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from the truth. As it turns out, their 11 adoptees were subjects of awful treatment. When authorities found them, they were being kept in cages, and the victims testified that they were often beaten, starved, and emotionally tortured. For example, inside these cage-like enclosures was reportedly an alarm that would go off anytime they tried to leave it, and so they were so terrified of setting it off, they would often soil themselves in the middle of the night rather than risk waking up one of their parents. The trial lasted about 2 years, and there was a lot of back and forth surrounding the reality of their neglect. Some community members came forward to say they were actually very loving parents, and Sharon and Michael insisted that the cages were actually to protect their adoptees from each other. However, with testimonies from the victims stating otherwise, by 2005 their sentence was decided. The Gravels ended up facing just 2 years in prison for their deeds, which, I mean, I might not know all the details of the case, but if you ask me, it seems like a very small amount of years. Eventually they served their sentence from April of 2009 to March of 2011, and now walk free once more. Coming in at number 4, Jacob Nesbitt. In the little town of Troy, Ohio, Jacob Nesbitt and his wife Frances were the picture-perfect power couple. They worked at the same company, which was pretty incredible for the time, and Frances was even the one to purchase the couple's beautiful cottage. Friends often came over for dinner parties and would talk about how happy they seemed, and pretty much from the outside, the pair seemed like an unstoppable force. So when Jacob called his neighbor in a panic one night saying that someone had bludgeoned and killed his wife, it was an utter blow to the entire community. However, as authorities soon figured out, it was a lot darker than Jacob would have his friends and family believe. Behind closed doors, it seems the picture-perfect couple were not so happy after all. Jacob complained that his wife regularly humiliated him, or at least he felt that way, as she was the top earner at the manufacturing company, and this did not sit right with him. Reportedly, she would tease Jacob in regards to her success over his, and eventually one night, after one sly comment too many, Jacob grabbed a club and whacked her over the head with it until she died. From there, he dragged her lifeless body into the bathtub, then burned the evidence of his crimes before realizing what he had done and calling his neighbor. In 1926, he was sentenced to a life behind bars for his crimes, however was released only 10 years later and able to walk free. Now, to be fair, that was a long time ago, so I mean, he's probably not around anymore, but still, the whole situation was pretty wild. Coming in at number 3, I-70 killer. You wouldn't think the shopping mall off the highway would be a dangerous place to be or get a job, but in the spring of 1992, it very well could have been. 30 years ago, along the Interstate 70, or I-70, an unidentified man was responsible for the death of 6 store clerks who all had the same things in common. They all worked in a shop off the same highway, they were all brunette with long hair, and they were mostly all women, except for one man. But he too had long hair and wore it in a ponytail, and police suspect suspect, the killer mistook him for a woman from behind. The attacker didn't seem too interested in anything but taking their lives, as he rarely robbed the stores after, and if he did, he would maybe take $100. After one of the attacks, a customer walked in the store and caught him, the two victims on the floor, and the attacker still with the weapon in his hand. But fearing for his life, he ran away as fast as he could, and in shock, didn't call authorities until nearly an hour later, well after the man had escaped the scene. A few years later, in 1994 Texas, two similar attacks took place, and again in 2001 Indiana. The cases have been featured on America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and Dark Minds, but the man has never been caught and remains walking among us to this day. Coming in at number 2, the Cleveland Torso Killer. Once again, another terrifying killer who has never been brought to justice is the Cleveland Torso Killer. Starting in the 1930s, horrifying crime sites began scattering across the city, each as bone-chilling as the last. Whoever this monster was had a sick mind, as each victim was always found the same: decapitated, plus most of them were also largely dismembered too. During the investigation, the convict enjoyed taunting the detective on his case, once leaving the bloody remains of two victims in full view of his office at City Hall, and at other times would provoke him by sending gruesome postcards. Now, as this monster was never identified, it's not ever been completely confirmed just how many people they hurt. However, the number is thought to be anywhere from 12 to 40, and of the 12 they were able to assure were the work of the Torso Killer, only 3 were able to be concretely identified due to the absolute wreckage that the killer put the victims through. Now, to be fair, this happened quite some time ago, so the likelihood of this killer being alive is incredibly improbable, but still terrifying nonetheless. And last up in our number 1 spot, Lester Eubanks. Born in 1943, Lester Eubanks is a terrifying fugitive who escaped prison 50 years ago and has never been tracked down since. Eubanks, who was 22 at the time of his conviction, was originally sentenced to death after killing Mary Ellen Diener in 1966. However, shortly after he was convicted for his brutal crime, his sentence was commuted to life after the Supreme Court ruled against the death penalty in 1972. The following year behind bars, reportedly, Eubanks was a model prisoner, and so nearing the Christmas of 1973, he was rewarded with a prison Christmas shopping trip. However, he took advantage of this opportunity and managed to sneak off unnoticed. His disappearance has eluded authorities ever since, so much so that he has even been featured on shows like Unsolved Mysteries, and as of the last year, he is listed on the US Marshals 15 most wanted fugitives. While he escaped prison in Ohio, from what authorities have been able to gather, it's suspected he's hiding in LA currently, and they are offering up to $50,000 for anyone with knowledge of his whereabouts. Starting us off at number 10 is John Justin Bunting. Known as the ringleader for the infamous Snowtown killings, Bunting is responsible for the death of 11 people in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. John Justin Bunting was a troubled man known to have an intense hatred for homosexuals as well as people interested in minors. And while I think we can all agree that it's understandable he hated those interested in minors, the problem is that he never had any proof that his victims were criminals of such things and would just assume they were because they were also gay. Most of his victims were either friends, roommates, or relatives, and along with his 3 other conspirators, he would kidnap the victims, then torture them in various sick ways before taking their lives. The case was uncovered when the remains of 8 people were found in barrels of acid in Snowtown, Australia. Then 3 days later, 2 more victims were found buried in a backyard. Allegedly, their final victim was fried and eaten by Bunting and his gang. After a series of trials, Bunting was ultimately declared the ringleader and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The others face similar charges, each serving 1 life sentence per charge, and these monsters will thankfully be locked up until their last days. Next up at number 9, Andre Thomas. Early on in life, Andre was unfortunately very badly abused by his mother and began to experience crushing auditory hallucinations at the age of 10. Then in 1999, while in grade 9, he met Laura, who soon became pregnant and brought Andre Jr. into the world later that year. Now with a son, Andre decided to drop out of high school and get a job to support his family, and by the age of 18, he and Laura finally married. The marriage, however, was short-lived, as Laura quickly caught on to the realities of his mental health issues and separated from Andre 4 months later. Tragically, however, the separation took a devastating toll on Andre's not yet diagnosed condition, which began convincing him that Laura was Jezebel and Andre Jr. was the Antichrist, and that he had to kill them. Finally, in March of 2004, Andre broke into her apartment and killed the entire family, each with a separate blade, as he claimed he did not want to contaminate their blood and allow the demons inside of them to live. After the incident, he attempted to take his own life. However, when that didn't go to plan, he removed one of his eyes instead. Eventually, after a long trial, he was sentenced to death for his crimes, until 3 years later when he removed his remaining eye and ingested it. While his sentence did not change officially, this incident catapulted Andre to be relocated to a psych ward, as he was eventually seen as not adequately fit to be executed. Coming in at number 8, the Icebox Killer. On June 2nd, 1991, 23-year-old Denise attended a concert in LA and began making her way home to Orange County around 2 a.m. However, the next morning when her parents, who she lived with, woke to find she wasn't there, they called police to make sure she hadn't been in an accident or hurt somehow. But all that was found was Denise's car on the side of a freeway with a drained battery. And for 3 years, no one had any clue where she was. That was until July of 1994, when a woman arrived at the house of a man named John Femerallo to purchase some paint. While there, she saw what appeared to be a very old rental car in her driveway, and after getting a strange feeling about him, she reached out to authorities, who determined the car was stolen. Still not connecting the two incidents, a police officer arrived on site to speak to John about the stolen vehicle. But when he arrived, he noticed an electrical cord running to a freezer from the back of the truck. Initially believing he was running some kind of lab, the deputy reached out to a locksmith to open the back of the truck. But to his horror, the body of a young, beaten, and tortured woman was inside, who was later determined to be the missing woman, Denise Huber. And tragically, after investigating the property, it became evident she had likely not been his only victim. John was convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 and remains locked up in California awaiting his fate. Coming in at number 7, the Pig Farmer Killer. Robert William Picton, or Willie, is a Canadian pig farmer responsible for killing 49 women between 1982 to 2002. Willie was known to be a fairly quiet and simple guy by his friends and family, and after his parents' death took over the family farm in 1980. But once he was in charge of the farm, he would soon become a monster. While it's not known exactly the detail of each crime, it's believed he would engage with escorts and then in the middle of, well, you know, would get extremely angry and blame them for thefts or crimes. The situation would escalate and he would ultimately handcuff the victims before attacking them and take their lives. But the creepiest part is that from there, he would take the bodies of his victims and put them through a wood chipper before feeding it to his pigs. And it's believed that some of the resulting bits would get mixed in with pork mince and sold to friends and family. Upon his 2002 arrest for his crimes, Willie admitted to all accounts and was even disappointed, as he was trying to round out his tally to an even 50 prior to being caught. Willie was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years, although it seems highly unlikely they are ever going to let him leave. Coming in at number 6, Randy Stephen Kraft. Between 1972 to 1983, Randy Stephen Kraft became known as the Scorecard Killer after being found responsible for the death of 16 young men in California. However, although only convicted of 16 victims, it's believed he harmed, tortured, and killed up to 67 men in the area. After high school graduation in 1963, Randy's plan was to become a US Senator, and so he enrolled in college for economics. However, through his college college years, he began to distance himself from his previous dreams and started drinking, partying, and getting himself into trouble. After just barely graduating, Randy joined the US Air Force and rose to Airman First Class. However, by 1969, he was discharged after the Army discovered he was gay. Around this same time, Kraft became distant from his family as they did not really approve of his sexuality either, and by 1970, he committed his first known essay on a boy. The following years, Kraft became obsessed and would lure young men, often of military background, to his van, then and take advantage of them before torturing their bodies until death and dumping them along the nearest freeway. This pattern repeated for over 10 years until he was finally caught and sentenced to death, where he now remains locked up awaiting his inevitable fate. Next up at number 5, BTK. To the public and his community, he was a totally normal, polite, and well-mannered man. Rader was an active member of his church and was actually elected president of the church council and even volunteered as a Cub Scout leader. He had a wife and kids who would describe him as a totally average and nice guy. But Rader had a dark secret that would soon change everything. Despite his outward persona, he was actually a truly disturbed man and was into some pretty terrifying things in the bedroom that eventually leaked their way into his crimes. To start off, I'll give you a hint. BTK is an abbreviation that stands for bind, torture, kill. And it was disturbing things along those lines that he liked to do to, as he put it, trapped and helpless women. But if a woman wasn't available, he would take pictures of himself in women's clothing wearing a mask of a woman's face and bind himself as he seemed to enjoy living out a fantasy as his own victims. Between 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader killed 10 women in Wichita, Kansas, and was known to send taunting letters to the authorities and media describing his crimes in gruesome detail. There was then a strange hiatus in his crimes for about 10 years, but thankfully this creep was arrested in 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each woman he killed. Coming in at number 4, George Emil Banks. Despite having a previous criminal record for an armed offense, Banks managed to get a job as a correctional officer in 1980. However, in 1982, Banks began worrying coworkers after he kept saying things like a race war would soon consume the world and that he wanted to protect his sons and daughters from the torment and agony of racism. Then, after a conflict with a supervisor, he was put on extended leave from the prison and ordered to be examined for mental health issues. Not long after his mandated leave from work, Banks, having consumed massive amounts of drugs and alcohol, tragically killed 13 people, 9 of which were his own family members, 3 former in-laws, and 1 bystander. Unbeknownst to Banks, his former brother-in-law was able to survive by hiding in the closet and called police to identify the attacker as Banks. Eventually, police were able to track him down at a friend's house, and after a 4-hour standoff, they were able to draw him out. During the trial, Banks explained his crimes by saying he did not want his offspring to be victimized in a race war, as he had suffered from racism much of his life as a biracial man. This explanation, however, did not sway the jury, and he was convicted to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 3, Joseph Fritzl. One of the most heartbreaking cases I have ever read about is the case of Joseph Fritzl. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21 he married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had a family of 7 together. Now, he was a very abusive man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. However, the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18 and he lured her into the basement, where he trapped her for the next 24 years. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she ran off to join a cult, and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to take her to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her little ones, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Coming in at number 2, Gary Ridgway. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led to him wetting the bed well into his teen years. However, after each incident, his mother would clean him up, leading Gary to have conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about killing her and doing unspeakable things to her corpse. When he got older, he joined the military, and it was during his time in combat that he became obsessed with escorts. Once he returned back to America, his first marriage ended quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon after, he married again, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires, and so he started strangling the women after he had got what he wanted from them, dumping their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods. At the time, she didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found buried in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said he had killed so many that he lost count and that he didn't even know the real number anymore. Last up in our number 1 spot, Edmund Kemper. One of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, early on Kemper showed signs of strange behavior. It started out with torturing insects, but by age 10 he buried his pet cat alive, waited for it to die, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. From there, things only got more concerning. By the age of 13, his parents divorced and his mother became his sole parental figure. However, she was an abusive alcoholic who mocked and humiliated the boy, and so their relationship turned into an extremely toxic one. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to try and be with his father, but eventually ended up living with his grandparents, and that is where things got really bad. At age 15, he killed both his grandparents and was arrested for the crimes. However, due to his age, he didn't face any criminal charges. By 1969, on his 21st birthday, he was released on parole against his psychologist's warning and sent to live with his mother. Kemper, however, hated his mother, and the two fought non-stop. By 1972, he began seeking out college student victims after a fight with his mother, and by 1973, he had taken the lives of 8 different women this way, becoming known in the public as the co-ed killer. Finally, in April of 1973, he bludgeoned his mother in her sleep before doing awful, unspeakable things to her decapitated head, and then called over her best friend and killed her too before turning himself in. In the end, Kemper was sentenced to life in prison despite his request to be tortured to death, and will remain behind bars until his final day.
Number 10. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy kidnapped, took advantage of, and ended the lives of dozens of young women during the 1970s and possibly earlier. After more than a decade of denials, Ted confessed to ending the lives of more than 30 people committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978, but experts estimate the real number could exceed 100. Investigators believe the crimes he committed were unrelated, done by different people, but it was all Ted. He often used charm to disguise his true intentions when kidnapping victims, and extended this tactic to law enforcement, the media, and the criminal justice system to maintain his claims of innocence. He typically approached women in public places, either asking for help by faking an injury or impersonating an authority figure. Once tricked into being led away, they would be bludgeoned unconscious and taken elsewhere to be taken advantage of and eventually die. At least 12 of his victims were
decapitated, and their severed heads were kept as mementos in his apartment. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. He was arrested for kidnapping and the deaths of many women. Now, he somehow ended up escaping prison twice, and then he was sentenced to death. He was put to death on January 24th, 1989. After his death, hundreds of revelers sang, danced, and set fireworks off in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out, then cheered as the white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. Safe to say, the public finally got their justice. Number 9. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, aka BTK, an abbreviation he gave himself for bind, torture, and kill, ended the lives of 10 people between the years of 1994 and 1991 in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. Now, he didn't just end lives, but also stalked women, and 2 women he stalked in the 1980s, and one whom he stalked in the mid-1990s filed restraining orders against him. He also sent taunting letters to police and media outlets describing the details of his crimes. Now, by 2004, the investigation of BTK was considered a cold case, but after a decade-long hiatus, Dennis initiated a series of 11 communications to the local media. This actively led directly to his arrest in February 2005, 30 years after he started his crimes. He pled guilty and was sentenced in 2005 to 10 life sentences, and though he's eligible for parole, it won't be until he's served at least 175 years. Number 8. Ariel Castro. Between 2002 and 2004, Ariel Castro kidnapped Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus from the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, and later held them captive in his home. Michelle told police that Castro had impregnated her at least 5 times and had induced miscarriages each time through beatings, hitting her with dumbbells, punching her, and slamming her against walls, and he also starved her. Now, all 3 girls were imprisoned at Castro's home until 2013, when Amanda successfully escaped with her 6-year-old daughter, whom she had given birth to while imprisoned, and contacted the police. Police rescued the 2 other girls and arrested Castro hours later. He was charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of taking advantage of the girls. He pled guilty to 937 criminal counts of taking advantage of the girls, kidnapping, and taking their lives as part of a plea bargain. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 1,000 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 7. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, went on a spree of ending lives with his firearm many times in New York that started in July 1976. He ended the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others by July 1977, terrorizing New Yorkers and gaining worldwide notoriety. David eluded the biggest police manhunt in the city's history while leaving letters that mocked the police and promised further crimes, which were highly publicized by the press. David was arrested on August 10, 1977, and subsequently indicted for 8 crimes that ended lives. He confessed to all of them and initially claimed to have been obeying the orders of a demon manifested in the form of a dog belonging to his neighbor. After being found mentally competent to stand trial, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences in a state prison with possibility of parole after 25 years. He then admitted that the dog and devil story was a hoax, which is shocking. Intense media coverage of the case made David a celebrity, and he seemed to enjoy it. In response, the New York State legislature enacted new statutes known popularly as the Son of Sam laws, designated to keep criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes. The statutes have remained law in New York State despite various legal challenges, and similar laws have been enacted in several other states. Number 6. Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer who ended the lives of 13 people, took advantage of 50 people, and had been involved in 120 burglaries in California between 1994 and 1986. He's responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout the state, each of which spawned a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. He was also linked to hundreds of incidents of theft, thefts, burglaries, vandalism, peeping, stalking, and prowling. He wasn't arrested until 2018 when DNA tracing from family members on genealogy sites linked him to his crimes. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 deaths and 13 counts of taking advantage of people. In August of that same year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His crimes finally caught up to him, and he probably never would have been caught if it wasn't for his family member using that site. Number 5. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, was initially convicted of 48 separate deaths. As part of his plea bargain, another conviction was added, bringing a total of convictions to 49. He ended the lives of women in the US state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Most of Gary's victims were alleged to be sex workers and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including runaway. The press gave him this nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River before his identity was unknown. He strangled his victims usually by hand, and after strangling them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County, often returning to the bodies to take advantage of them. On November 30th, 2001, Gary was arrested for the deaths of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA profiling evidence. As part of a plea bargain where he agreed to disclose the locations of still missing women, he was spared the death penalty. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, an additional life sentence, and 480 more years for tampering with evidence. Number 4. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton worked full-time at his family's pig farm after inheriting it in the early 1980s in Vancouver, Canada. It was at this point it was believed that he started ending people's lives, and when he was done with their bodies, he would then feed them to his pigs to get rid of the evidence. He was finally arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 for the deaths of 6 women, and was also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side, but these charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the longest possible sentence for second-degree under Canadian law at the time he was sentenced. The conviction was appealed twice by his lawyers, but ultimately unanimously rejected by Canada's Supreme Court. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that he told the officer he wanted to end the life of another woman to make it an even 50, and that he was caught because he was sloppy. Number 3. Jeffrey Dahmer. It has been reported that Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. On July 22, 1991, he asked Tracy Edwards to accompany him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs and drink beer for $100. While there, things escalated and Jeffrey tried to end Tracy's life. Tracy escaped and flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers explaining what happened. They then went to the apartment and an officer saw an open drawer which, upon closer inspection, contained scores of Polaroid pictures, many of which were human bodies in various stages of dismemberment, so they arrested Jeffrey. Then a more detailed search of the apartment revealed a total of 4 severed heads in the kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Jeffrey's bedroom inside a closet. Investigators discovered blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle. And in his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were found, and that is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. Number 2. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by the ending of people's lives and taking advantage of them. He also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live, by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. He was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts to take someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was then sentenced to death and was on death row. And coming in at number 1 is the Zodiac. The Zodiac took the lives of 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969. The Zodiac coined this name in a series of taunting letters and cards that he mailed to regional newspapers. Some of the letters included cryptograms or ciphers in which he claimed that he was collecting his victims as slaves for the afterlife. He targeted young couples and a lone male cab driver. 2 of his wounded victims survived, and it was said that he wore a black executioner's hood with a chest piece with Zodiac's crosshair symbol stitched in white on it. The Zodiac claimed to have taken the lives of 37 victims and has been linked to several other cold cases, some in Southern California or outside the state. Now, while many theories regarding the identity of him have been suggested, the only suspect authorities ever publicly named was Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher who died in 1992. Now, it seems like the victims may never get their justice, as he is still unidentified today.
Coming in at number 10 is the Colonial Parkway Killer. An active criminal between 1986 to 1989, this person specifically targeted couples traveling Virginia's scenic parkway late at night. During that time, 3 couples were found dead and 1 couple went missing but is presumed to have the same fate. A different couple was found each year, leading authorities to question, was this person only killing once a year, or were this just the ones they found? The cases had received major media coverage, including documentaries, news articles, and TV shows as recent as 2021, but despite having over 130 suspects, the FBI have yet to be able to put a name to the face of the crimes. One bizarre piece of this puzzle is that in 2010, a note was discovered in a box taken years earlier from one of the victims' apartments. The note stated that she was to meet someone in a blue van at a rest stop, and when the Virginia State Police was asked about this, they claimed that the note had been previously examined. But in 1989, during the time of the murders, an investigator involved told case reporters that he was unaware of the existence of the note. So, if you ever find yourself driving the scenic route of Virginia, do yourself a favor and don't make a pit stop. Next up at number 9 is Glenn Stewart Godwin. In 1996, this killer was added to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's top 10 most wanted list after he escaped from a California prison back in 1987. At the time of his escape, he was serving a 26 to life sentence for the death of Kim LaValle. Trying to hide the body, took her up a mountain and decided to use a homemade explosive in an attempt to make the remains disappear. However, residents of the mountain only a few months later came across some remains, thus sparking his arrest. When he escaped prison in 1987, he fled to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico and joined up with a cartel, but was found and convicted in 1991 and sent to jail in Guadalajara. It was here that he took the life of a fellow inmate and then escaped a second time only 5 months later. Authorities have yet to track him down after 31 years, but it is believed that he is still on the loose today. So, keep your eyes peeled if you're ever in Latin America, because the FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for anyone with information that could lead to his arrest. Next up at number 8 is Bible John. Active between 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow, Scotland, the man nicknamed Bible John is believed to be responsible for the death of 3 young women. All 3 of his victims were young brunettes who he would lure in at a local dance hall in the city. The unidentified criminal is referred to as Bible John, as according to a key witness, saw a man who picked up women yet quoted extensively from the Old Testament and frowned on adultery. But of course, taking the lives of young women seemed alright in his books. For decades, the Glasgow police have tirelessly searched for the monster, but have remained unsuccessful in tracking him down. To date, the search for Bible John has been the most extensive manhunt in Scotland criminal history. It was also the first time in Scotland's history that a composite drawing of the perpetrator was allowed and publicized in an attempt to get more information from the public. Although there have been a few suspects over the years, years, none have been convicted, and to this day it is unknown who is responsible for these horrible attacks. Next up at number 7 is the Monster of Florence. Active between 1968 and 1985 in Florence, Italy, this man is responsible for the death of 8 young couples who he would target while they snuck away into the woods trying to be intimate outside of their homes. Now, in 1970s Italy, this could be a common occurrence, as it was customary for young couples to not live with each other until marriage, and with nowhere else to go, sometimes the great outdoors was their only alternative. The part about this that really gets under your skin is that the female victims would be found mutilated, with their intimate areas removed with, quote, a surgical precision that led police to believe he had a medical background. More than 100,000 men were investigated for these crimes, with some being arrested or even tried, but eventually another killing would occur, exonerating them and forcing police to continue their search. The search continued for this gruesome monster, and a local farmer named Pietro Pacini was convicted in 1994 for 6 of the killings, but later in 1996 it was overturned. Pacini then died a few years later, but it is strongly believed he did not work alone, and while 5 accused men have been sent to jail at one point or another, they were all eventually released, leaving this case wide open with the alleged convict running free. Coming in at number 6, we have the Upstairs Lounge Fire. In June of 1973, a New Orleans gay bar was the victim of the second worst attack on the American queer community, only surpassed in 2016 by the Pulse nightclub massacre. The Upstairs Lounge was a beloved hub with drag queens and music, but sadly on this 1973 Pride weekend, everything would change. The bar was located on the 2nd floor of the building, and out of nowhere patrons started to smell gasoline, but initially thought nothing of it. A few minutes later, a doorbell rang, and when someone opened to see who was there, a fireball was thrown into the room and immediately erupted the room into an inferno. It is now known the perpetrator used a Molotov cocktail. The fire burned fast, lasting only 20 minutes, but in that time 32 lost their lives and another 15 were severely injured by the attack. The survivors of the fire were taken to identify the bodies of those who died in the tragedy, but according to one survivor, many of the identified bodies remained unclaimed by family members as they were ashamed and wanted nothing to do with their gay kin. After the attacks, many survivors refused to show their faces, afraid of the homophobia that would follow due to the media coverage. No arrests were ever made, and it's very likely that whoever committed this atrocity continues to walk the streets of New Orleans to this day. Next up at number 5, the Stone Man. Active between the years of 1985 to 1988 in Mumbai, India, this mysterious criminal was never caught. Believed to be responsible for the death of 26 people, the Stone Man got their name due to their cruel methods. The Stone Man would target homeless people sleeping alone on the streets at night and used concrete blocks or stones, sometimes weighing up to 65 pounds, to carry out their gruesome plan. According to the media, 12 people died at the hands of the Stone Man in Mumbai, India between 1985 to 1988, and then they moved to Calcutta, where another 12 people were found dead in a single year. Now, it's not known for sure if the Calcutta killer was the same as whoever committed the atrocities in Mumbai. Authorities did mention it could have been a copycat, but most seem to believe it was all one person, or at least a group of people working together. No one has been charged for any of the crimes, and all remain unsolved. Coming in at number 4, the Doodler. This next criminal was from San Francisco and active for just 1 year between 1974 to 1975. However, in that year, the unidentified killer is believed to have taken 16 lives. He was known to target specifically white men in gay clubs, and got his name as he was known to sit around doodling pictures of them to draw them in. Once they got to talking, he would lure them elsewhere, like a lake or a park, and follow through with the rest of his evil plan. Unfortunately, due to the rampant homophobia of the time, when police did find a suspect for the case, they couldn't proceed with criminal charges, as none of the 3 surviving victims of the brutal attacks felt safe to out themselves publicly by testifying in court, fearful of how the consequences might impact their daily lives. The case remains open with no known suspect of who committed the crimes, and in 2019 the police offered a $100,000 reward to anyone with more information of the killer. Next up at number 3, the Craigslist Ripper. Also known as the Long Island Killer, this man is thought to be responsible for the death of 17 people between the years of 1996 to 2010, and got his name as he was known to target women of the night who advertised their services on Craigslist. Although his crimes began in 1996, none of his victims were found until 2010, many wrapped up in sacks or garbage bags along the Long Island shore. It's speculated that he may have been, or that he currently is, a police officer, as whoever committed these crimes seemed to have an in-depth knowledge of the investigation techniques not typically known by just anyone. Sadly, of the 17 found, only 5 have been able to be properly identified due to the nature of how he left the bodies. Coming in at number 2, the Zodiac Killer. Possibly the most famous repeat convict known to date, this criminal is as scary as it gets. Active in California during the late 60s and early 70s, the Zodiac Killer seemed to get off on the chase, sending in letters and highly encrypted clues to the police that supposedly would reveal his identity and more, if only the puzzles could be deciphered. Not only would he send in cards to the police, but he was known to mail in his taunting clues to local newspapers, threatening awful consequences if they were not printed. There are 7 known victims that he is known to be responsible for, 2 surviving his brutal attacks, although he claims to have killed 37. The especially creepy part about this particular monster is that, as detailed in his letters, he believed that all those whose life he ended would become his slaves in the afterlife, and that he would be sent to paradise. Although the Zodiac ceased all written communication by 1974, the case remained open since 1969, with no known perpetrator. And last up in our number 1 spot, Issei Sagawa. Nicknamed the Kobe Cannibal, this monster is not for the faint of heart. Now, unlike others on the list, he's only known for 1 brutal attack, but what he did will leave you speechless. Sagawa was born in Japan and says he had known since childhood of his gruesome instincts, but for whatever reason would always back out of his desires at the last second. All of this changed, however, when he moved to Paris to pursue his PhD. It was there that he met Renee Hartvelt, one of his classmates who he decided was the right victim. Sagawa says he picked her due to her beauty and stature, as he saw himself as weak, ugly, and small, and believed that he could absorb her energy. He invited her over on the pretense of a dinner, but knew all along what he planned to do. He had it thought out. He took the woman's life, and I'm sure you can imagine what he did with her body, considering the monster's name. After 4 days, the body began to decompose, and he knew that he had to get her out of his apartment or risk being arrested for his crimes. However, he was caught attempting to dispose of her remains in a nearby lake by French authorities and was, of course, arrested immediately. After awaiting trial for 2 years, a judge ruled him legally insane and unfit for trial, ordering him to live out the rest of his life in a mental institution. He was deported out of France and sent back to Japan, where he was immediately committed. But here's where it gets crazy. Once in this institution, the psychologist deemed him fully sane, and that his perversions were the reason for his crimes, not insanity. But since his charges had been dropped while in France, all documents were sealed and nothing was sent to Japanese authorities, meaning that legally, the institution could not detain him any longer. After only 2 years away from society, Sagawa walked out freely and remains free to this day. Coming in at number 10, the Eastbound Strangler. Back in 2006, one fateful night, this monster took the life of 4 women and was never seen from again. The Eastbound Strangler targeted 4 New Jersey escorts and left them behind the Golden Key Motel, face down, in a row, facing east and about 60 feet apart from each other. The victims were left fully clothed, minus having their socks and shoes removed, and all appeared to have been killed in the same way. Early on, there was speculation that it could have been linked to the Long Island Killer, another unknown attacker, but it was later ruled out by investigators. Despite 15 years of investigation, they have never been able to come close to any leads, and whoever was responsible has never been caught, and the $25,000 reward remains unclaimed. Next up at number 9, the Texas Killing Field. Now, what would seem like a normal 25-acre patch of land just off the highway near Houston, Texas, is actually a haunting field where more than 30 bodies have been found since the early 1970s. Nearly all of the victims found have been young women and girls, and there are apparently many more missing women from the area, but no remains beyond the 30 victims have ever been recovered. Despite the authorities' best effort, it is unknown how many perpetrators have actually contributed to this field, though it's suspected that more than one person is responsible. To date, only 3 of the cases have been successful in convicting an attacker, and the remaining 27 remain unsolved, with no leads and no luck of where to turn next. In 2011, a film entitled Texas Killing Fields was made about the series of crimes associated with the notorious plot of land, but it was not received well, and unfortunately did not kickstart anything more than upset families of the victims and a few false confessions to the atrocities. Coming in at number 8, the Flat Tire Murderer. Active between 1975 to 1976, this monster is believed to have been responsible for between 12 to 35 deaths, though the exact number is still unknown. The perpetrator got his name as allegedly he would offer to help women traveling alone who had gotten a flat tire, but unbeknownst to them, it was the attacker who had deflated their tires in the first place. While not all victims followed this exact formula, it was certainly the method for the first of his 2 victims. Bodies of the victims were found dumped into canals, while their cars were found abandoned miles away. Authorities believe the cause of their deaths to have been from drowning, and were all found with signs of being taken advantage of prior to their death. Over the years, with no culprits being found for these vicious attacks, some have suggested it could have been the work of notorious Ted Bundy, but that's merely speculation and has no evidence to back it up. For all we know, the Flat Tire Murderer remains on the loose. Coming in at number 7, the Honolulu Strangler. Credited with being responsible for the death of 5 women, this unidentified killer was active only between 1985 to 1986 and was never caught. The sadistic perpetrator was known to target women, but that seems to be where the links stop. All of his victims were brutally attacked and taken advantage of, and then left tied up on the street to be found by police. Authorities took this case very seriously, as at the time it was the first known repeat criminal of his kind in Honolulu. Local authorities put together a 27-person task force, but even with all that manpower, they were never able to find the attacker. There was hope when a man named Howard Gay was arrested, as he seemed to fit the profile, but he was eventually released after further interrogation. Years later, in 2017, the case was covered by a true crime podcast, and once again in 2022, but despite its popularity, we have no idea what happened to the Honolulu Strangler. Next up at number 6, the West Mesa Bone Collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar, a human bone. Little did she know, she'd actually stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. Nicknamed the West Mesa Bone Collector, this killer was active between 2001 and 2005 and was a truly sick man. He was known to target young women, usually Hispanic, and almost always involved in late night services or with connections to the drug trade, but not exclusively, making it hard to identify just why he chose the victims he did. The thing is, during 2001 to 2005, there were reportedly more missing persons than usual, but I guess the New Mexico police didn't feel much need to dive into the disappearance of women involved in this type of work. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he is responsible for the deaths and that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Police and FBI have never been able to track down who is responsible for ending these young women's lives, and the monster remains on the loose. Coming in at number 5, the Frankfurt Slasher. Between 1985 and 1990, this monster preyed upon women in a rough neighborhood in Philadelphia. The Frankfurt Slasher was known for being incredibly violent, mutilating the victims' bodies past recognition. What was designed to be on the inside of the body, like organs and muscle tissue, would often end up exposed, and then after having his way with the victims, he would leave them on the street, strategically posed for when the police would find them. Believed to be responsible for the death of 9 women, the Frankfurt Slasher targeted specifically white women, usually ladies of the night, with a public history of mental illness. But oddly, the ages of the victims ranged from 28 all the way to 68. One man, Leonard Christopher, was convicted of one of the crimes in 1990, but more happened once he was put away, causing concern that maybe they'd found the wrong man. Further, significant questions have popped up regarding the quality of evidence they used to convict Christopher. He apparently did not match witness reports of the white man seen with other victims, leaving many in fear that the Frankfurt Slasher remains uncaught and unidentified. Next up at number 4, the Chicago Strangler. Between 2001 to 2018, a reported 75 Chicago women all lost their lives the same way: suffocation. But it wasn't until 2019 that a task force was made to try and stop these killings from happening. Originally, authorities denied that there was any link of the crimes and denied it all being one person committing them, hence the delay in gathering a task force. But after an article from the Chicago Tribune ran in 2018, they were forced to admit that it was in fact a distinct possibility. As was uncovered in the 2018 article, there was in fact a few distinct links between the crimes. All the victims were women, all the victims were killed the same way, and nearly all the victims were black. Coincidence or not, the optics were very bad, as it seemed the authorities were not taking the death of black women seriously, and the task force was created. Then in 2021, a docuseries on Discovery Plus began streaming, and though activists were demanding answers from the Chicago Police Department, they still maintained they could neither confirm nor deny if the killings were from a repeat convict. We still have no clue who killed these women, and they still remain out in the world walking free. Next up at number 3, the I-70 killer. You wouldn't think the shopping mall off the highway would be a dangerous place to be or get a job, but in the spring of 1992, it very well could have been. 30 years ago, along the Interstate 70, or I-70, an unidentified man was responsible for the death of 6 store clerks who all had the same thing in common. They all worked in a shop off the same highway, they were all brunettes with long hair, and they were mostly all women. Except for one man, but he too had long hair and wore a ponytail, and police suspected the killer mistook him for a woman from behind. The attacker oddly didn't seem too interested in anything but taking their lives, as he rarely robbed the stores after, and if he did, he would maybe take $100. After one of the attacks, a customer actually walked in the store and caught him, the 2 victims on the floor, and the attacker still with the weapon in his hand. But fearing for his life, he ran away as fast as he could, and in shock, didn't call the authorities until nearly an hour later. well after the man had escaped the scene. A few years later, in 1994 Texas, 2 similar attacks took place, and then again in 2001 Indiana. The cases have been featured on America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and Dark Minds, but the man has never been caught and remains walking among us to this day. Coming in at number 2, Hercules. While some say killer, others say vigilante. This perpetrator separates themselves from the rest. The distinction between Hercules and, say, the Frankfurt slasher? Well, Hercules only attacks those who have already committed a brutal crime. Or rather, one very specific brutal crime, taking advantage of women. In 2019, 3 men were found in Bangladesh, each shot and each with a note tied around their neck. While not identical, all the notes followed the same structure. First stating the name of the victim whose neck the note was wrapped around, followed by the name of the victim who they had attacked. It would then explain that this was the fate of those who committed this crime and that others should beware. Signed, Hercules. Law enforcement has yet to uncover who is responsible for these deaths, but have no clue if the killings are by one person or a group of people. It sure has sparked debate, with many questioning who the real bad guy is here. And last up today at number 1, Pedro Lopez. Nicknamed the Monster of Andes, Pedro Lopez might be one of the most notorious criminals alive. After being kicked out of his childhood home at just 8 years old for taking advantage of his younger sister, Lopez was evicted and sent to live the rest of his childhood on the streets of Colombia. According to Lopez, not long after he was thrown out, he was abducted and assaulted, and then by 13 was taken in by a family, but after 2 years ran away. By 1978, Lopez claims to have been responsible for the death of 100. That same year, an indigenous tribe caught him and was going to execute him, but a nearby missionary took pity on him and demanded they release him and call him into the authorities. The police, however, for whatever reason, promptly released him from custody. From there, he fled to Colombia once again, followed by Ecuador, where he reports to have attacked about 3 girls a week, and when he was caught and arrested in 1980, he confessed to killing 200 victims, but there's suspicion that it could have been worse, as many as 360. Though he did remain jailed for 14 years, in 1994 he was released from prison for good behavior and sent back to Colombia to serve the rest of his sentence in a psychiatric facility. But only 4 years later, in 1998, he was ruled legally sane and released on a $50 bail. Rather predictably, he fled the country after his release, and a warrant for his arrest was promptly released. His whereabouts remain a mystery, and no one knows if he has committed any more attacks since he vanished.
The youngest guy currently on the FBI top 10 list, we have Alejandro Roselos Castello at number 9. He is an American criminal that is only 17 years old, and he killed a 23-year-old woman. That woman was someone Alejandro dated. This teenager is very dangerous. The murder took place in Charlotte, North Carolina back in 2016. And ever since then, the police and the FBI are unable to track this kid down. Number 8, do you guys remember Kony 2012? Well, Joseph Kony is known as the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army that is responsible for abducting as many as 2 million people. Is this real life right now? Kony also forced some of these children to kill their own parents. Well, the war against Kony started in 2012. $800 million was spent to try to track this man down, but over the years, there was no successful to kill or capture this man. There was a YouTube video talking in detail about who Kony was and the massive problem happening in our society because of this man. The video was titled Kony 2012, and it currently has over 100 million views.
Alright, moving on to number 7 now, we have Jason Derek Brown. This fugitive from LA has been on the FBI's most wanted list since July 2007 for a first-degree murder and armed robbery that occurred 3 years prior. In 2004, Robert Keith Palomares, a 24-year-old armored truck guard, was carrying the weekend deposits outside a theater in Phoenix. At 10 a.m., Brown ambushed him with a gun, shooting him in the head 5 times. Brown then took a bag containing $56,000 in cash and fled down an alley on a bicycle. Palomares was transported transported to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. Within a week, police had issued an arrest warrant for Brown. He fled to Nevada, then California, then Oregon before disappearing completely off the grid. Police have 200 leads about where he might be, although they often conflict with each other. He could be in the US, Canada, or even France or Thailand. The FBI is now offering up to $200,000 for information leading to his capture.
Alright, moving on to number 4 now, we have John Patrick Hannan, who is actually known as the world's most successful prison fugitive who has been on the run for the past 60 years. That's a 6-0. John Hannan was just 22 years old when he was arrested and put into jail. He was sentenced for 21 months behind bars for stealing a car and assaulting 2 police officers. But he was able to break out of the facility just 30 days after. This guy is either a super genius or just a big dum-dum. I say super genius because he was able to be in the run for the past 60 years. And I say he's a big dum-dum because who escapes from prison when you only have to serve a 21-month sentence? Good behavior might even have gotten him out earlier. Who knows?
Next up, number 3 now, we have Semyon Mogilovich. This Ukrainian-born man is a Russian mafia boss, or rather, he is the boss of bosses. He is at the helm of most Russian mafia syndicates in the world. His vast empire has resulted in the FBI referring to him as the most dangerous mobster in the world. Mogilovich is involved in weapons trafficking, contract murders, extortion, trafficking, on an international scale. He hasn't lived a very secretive life either, and his homes and private life are all there to see on his Wikipedia page. The problem for international law enforcement is how well connected and protected he is. In 2006, former Russian Secret Service member Alexander Litvinenko alleged that Mogilovich had a good relationship with a Russian president known as Vladimir Putin. Litvinenko was assassinated via radiation poisoning not long after that allegation. He used to be on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, but was removed back in 2015. This is because the USA and Russia doesn't actually have an extradition treaty, meaning Russia is not obliged to hand him over to the US if they do catch him, basically making him untouchable. Next up at number 2 now, we have Shane O'Brien. He's a suspected killer who has been on the run for 2 years from UK police. He's now on Interpol's worldwide most wanted list. The 30-year-old is alleged to have murdered 21-year-old Josh Hanson in an unprovoked knife attack in a bar in West London in 2015. According to witnesses, O'Brien removed an item from his coat pocket and plunged it into Josh's neck. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A £50,000 reward is now being offered for any information leading to his prosecution. He's described as white, 6 feet tall, with grey eyes, dark brown hair, a full beard, and a tattoo on his back of an owl holding a skull.
Starting us off at number 10, Rashad Hawkins. He may not be evil, but he certainly isn't innocent. Rashad Hawkins was attending child support court and was sentenced to serve some time due to his negligence and failure to pay. Now, instead of doing the time or paying what he owed, Rashad decided running was the route he was gonna take. Before he was even taken into custody, Hawkins managed to evade authorities by jumping over a second-story railing and fleeing the building before they could catch him. He stayed on the run for 20 days before eventually being caught and now faces charges of criminal trespassing, assault, and evading arrest. So all in all, he made it much worse on himself. Next up at number 9, Nicholas Garrison. Arrested with several drug charges back in 2020, Nicholas tried his luck and made a run while in the courthouse. Out of nowhere, he manages to escape the grasps of the sheriffs detaining him and bolts, pushing past others in the courthouse, with the sheriffs chasing after him close behind. Once outside of the chamber, he headed for the staircase, at which point the sheriff made a leaping dive down the stairs head first to try and catch him, ultimately breaking a few ribs and getting a concussion. Garrison managed to escape him and sprinted down the stairs as fast as he could. He was later found in a motel and arrested, and now faces far worse charges than his original 6 months. Next up at number 8, Mysterious Man. Now, unfortunately, I could not find the name of this escapee. All that I know is that he was from Washington, so if you know his name, leave it below in the comments. The mystery man took off his prison uniform while still in the courtroom, which I can only assume was empty. But if that was the case, why was a convict left alone in the first place? Whatever. that's not the point. Now, stripped of his uniform and semi-blending in with the civilians in the courthouse, he bolts straight out the front door, running past many witnesses. Although from what I can tell on the blurry footage, it does look like he was running barefoot, which, I don't know, that's kind of clue number 2 for me. People aren't generally running around barefoot in a courthouse with good news, but hey, what do I know? Anyways, he was found a few hours later and put back into custody, and like every other person on this list, things were much worse from there on out for him. And next up at number 7, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard. I'm gonna go out on a limb here with little to no evidence of this being fact, but I'm gonna guess that most courtroom judges aren't starting off their day expecting to have to run around chasing delinquents down a flight of stairs. Well, whether Judge Buzzard saw it coming or not, this is exactly what his day entailed. When 2 young men, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard, came into his courtroom on October 16th, 2018. The 2 men made a run for it straight out of the courtroom, still in their handcuffs, and the judge quickly shed his robe and bolted right after them, chasing them down 4 flights of stairs, all the while yelling, "Stop, stop, you're only making this worse." But still they continued. Buzzard only managed to catch Howard, but Jacobson didn't make it much further before being caught by authorities after just a few blocks outside. They should have listened to the judge, because they did indeed make it much worse. Next up at number 6, Leonid Gracier. In 2019, Leonid was convicted for killing his younger sister, and upon his arrest told authorities Satan had demanded him. Well, it wouldn't be the first time we've heard that excuse. Seemingly unfazed by what he had committed, he was put into custody in Moscow, where apparently it's common to put prisoners into these boxes to detain them. Perhaps what they seemed to forget was handcuffs, however, as the killer tried to escape the confines by crawling up into the ceiling of the courthouse. He was nearly successful, but didn't manage to get very far before police tased him and pulled him back down from the ceiling. During his confession, he said he didn't regret his actions, and essentially that he stood by his crimes and said that he had made everything better in doing them. So while he didn't technically succeed in his escape, I think we can all agree that we're glad that's the case. Coming in at number 5, a helping hand. Like most things in life, things are easier with the help of your friends. But unfortunately in this case, Callum was a 21-year-old helping his teenage friend escape a 5-month jail sentence. At first, the teen was just convicted for stealing a cell phone and for whatever reason decided his best option was to make a break for it. Bailiffs went after him but weren't actually too worried at first, as the door to exit required someone to push a button on the other side of it for it to open. Well, little did they know he had someone to do that very job. The accomplice, Callum Finter, ended up also being arrested for helping the teen escape, but he tried to claim that it was a total accident and he didn't mean to push the button. I don't know, but it seems pretty intentional to me looking at the footage there. This story didn't seem to win over anyone, and he was ultimately sentenced to 3 months in jail for aiding his friend in his escape. The teen was on the run for 2 days but was later found and ended up having another 6 months added to his sentence. Have you ever heard the saying, "Not all help is good help"? Just saying, it might have been something to think about before getting caught up in all this mess. Next up at number 4, Quantrell Schwartzlow. This piece of work was under arrest for some brutal domestic violence, and despite that, was still left alone. Now, I don't know what it is about leaving criminals alone for a minute, especially those that are committed for some serious and dangerous crimes, but it just seems to me like once they are in custody, they should be continuously observed. Well, as you guessed it, Quantrell should have been kept under a closer watch. Though he was handcuffed, that didn't seem to stop him from escaping out of a window in an interrogation room in what can only be described as a swan dive out of the building. How he managed it, I don't quite understand. How he didn't break every bone in his body on the way down, also a mystery. But luckily he was caught about 3 hours later hiding out at a friend's house and was eventually charged not only for his escape, but also the unruly crimes he committed on his girlfriend. Next up at number 3, Christopher Lee Ruffin. Back in 2012, while appearing in court for a probation violation, Christopher was sentenced to another 90 days in jail. Now, I don't know what he was originally charged for or any of the details of his case, but all in all, 90 days doesn't seem like it's as bad as it could get. But apparently apparently it was still too much for Christopher. His runaway is especially wild to me because it's not just that he managed to escape, but he was actually tased by 2 of the bailiffs and still managed to continue running while being tased. He then ran past security and straight out the front door. In the next few hours, he tried to get multiple rides, threatening strangers to drive him out of town, but the police ended up catching up to him and took him back to jail. Now, this is just a wild guess, but I have a feeling he was looking at more than 90 days after the shenanigans he pulled. Coming in at number 2, Deontay Rasiles. In 2014, this convict was arrested for the burglary and killing of a woman named Jill Sue, for which he claimed he was being framed. Well, as he puts it, to prove his innocence, he decided to escape the courthouse with the help of some other inmates and his girlfriend. And I mean, really, what says innocent more than a secret inmate collab and a getaway car? It seems like his accomplice helped to remove his handcuffs, and then he had some twin brothers distract a guard and give him a signal for when to make a run for it. He then slipped out of a fire exit and ran to the getaway car where his girlfriend had a change of clothes for him, and they drove off in a flash. This was a very high profile case considering what he was on trial for, and caused a huge manhunt across Florida, with SWAT teams and helicopters roaming the city all hours of the day. He was missing for a week, but thankfully was found. Now back in custody, he faces a potential life sentence with the death penalty for his crimes, although he still maintains his innocence in the entire ordeal. And last up in our number 1 spot, Ted Bundy. Ah yes, the notorious and downright evil killer who needs no introduction. But despite being convicted of killing and committing other horrors to at least 30 women, he was granted way more independence than should have been allowed to someone of his security level. People felt he was very charming and seemed to conveniently forget what he was in custody for. Well, Bundy took advantage of that, and in June of 1977, while on trial for one of his many killings, he was left alone in a courtroom library to prepare, as he was representing himself in court. While alone and out of sight from the guards, Bundy managed to open a window and make a run for it. He jumped out of the 2nd-story window, injuring his ankle, and managed to disappear into the woods for 6 days. He was, of course, found, convicted, and eventually sentenced to death for all of his crimes, but it's one of the craziest escape stories to this day.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Jason Barnum. Jason Barnum, also known as Eyeball due to his tattooed right eye, is a figure who has gained notoriety for his life of crime and distinctive appearance. Born in Alaska, Barnum's life took a dark turn as he succumbed to a struggle with addiction and criminal activities. In 2012, Barnum's life of crime culminated in a series of events that would land him in a maximum security prison. He was involved in a string of burglaries, car thefts, and a shooting incident with the police that left an officer injured. His actions during this crime spree demonstrated a dangerous disregard for human life and the law. During his court proceedings, the judge, while acknowledging Barnum's difficult upbringing and struggles with addiction, sentenced him to 22 years in prison for his crimes. In our number 9 spot today, we have Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin is a figure of terror known by the spine-chilling epithet, the chessboard killer. His goal, as horrifying as it was unique, was to take a life for each space on a chessboard, a total of 64 individuals. This chilling ambition set him apart from other criminals and made him a feared figure not only in his operating base of Moscow, but also around the world. Alexander's reign of terror was marked by a level of brutality that left a trail of carnage in his wake. His victims were not merely killed, they were subjected to violent deaths that really showed the depth of his ruthlessness. The authorities eventually convicted him for 48 killings, however, Pichushkin himself claims a higher count, insisting that his total stands at 60 victims. Whether this claim is the truth or an attempt to inflate his notoriety remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the sheer scale of his crimes, coupled with his terrifying goal, makes him a figure of dread. His chilling ambition and the brutal reality of his crimes make Alexander Pichushkin a prisoner whose release would be a nightmare come true. In our number 8 spot today we have Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair is a name that has become synonymous with cunning escapes and audacious evasion. Convicted for killering and burglary in the 80s, McNair's story took a turn for the extraordinary when he demonstrated a knack for escaping prison. Not once, but 3 times. His most infamous escape was from a maximum security prison in Louisiana in 2006. In a plot that seemed straight out of a Hollywood movie, McNair slipped out of the prison work detail by mailing himself out of the prison in a crate. Once outside, he managed to evade capture for over a year, leading authorities on a nationwide manhunt. McNair's ability to charm and deceive, coupled with his physical fitness, made him a formidable fugitive. His escapes and subsequent recaptures were widely covered in the media, earning him a reputation as a real-life escape artist. Finally captured in Canada in 2007, McNair is now held in the Supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths some prisoners will go to regain their freedom. Richard Lee McNair is undoubtedly a figure you pray never escapes again. In our number 7 spot today we have Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols is a name that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the horrific Oklahoma City bombing. Nichols, along with his accomplice Timothy McVeigh, orchestrated one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in US history. On April 19, 1995, a truck exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring hundreds more. Nichols, a former army buddy of McVeigh's, was deeply involved in the planning and preparation of the attack. His anti-government sentiments and extremist beliefs fueled his participation in this act of terror. Following the attack, Nichols was quickly apprehended and brought to justice. In a trial that gripped the nation, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, as well as other charges relating to the seriousness of his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and is currently held in the ADX Florence maximum security prison in Colorado, the same one we just talked about. In our number 6 spot today we have Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is a name that evokes a chilling sense of dread and is notoriously known as the Green River Killer. This ominous moniker stems from his gruesome modus operandi, which involved leaving the bodies of his victims along the Green River in Washington. The river, once a symbol of natural beauty, became a grim reminder of Ridgway's merciless killing spree. Ridgway's crimes were not sporadic instances of violence, but a series of premeditated killings that made him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Officially, he was convicted of 49 crimes, but the actual number of his victims is believed to be at least double that count. What made Ridgway even more terrifying was not just the scale of his crimes, but also his attitude towards them. In a chilling display of lack of empathy, Ridgway confessed his crimes without any visible signs of emotion or remorse. This cold-blooded confession provided a terrifying insight into the mind of a remorseless killer, revealing a man devoid of any empathy or guilt for his heinous actions. The enormity of his crimes, coupled with his emotionless demeanor, makes Gary Ridgway a prisoner whose release would be a horrifying prospect. His chilling legacy continues to haunt those familiar with his story, making him a figure whose freedom is preyed against. In our number 5 spot today we have Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is more widely recognized by his chilling moniker BTK, an abbreviation which disturbingly describes his preferred method of killing. Rader's reign of terror spanned over 17 years in Wichita, Kansas, a time during which he took a perverse pleasure in his horrific acts, savoring the terror he instilled in the hearts of residents. Rader wasn't merely a man who committed heinous crimes, he was a sadist who reveled in his victims' suffering and the dread he inspired. His chilling letters to the police, where he arrogantly flaunted his crimes, added an extra layer of psychological terror to his spree. The letters served as a chilling reminder of his presence, keeping the community in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. These communications revealed a deeply disturbed mind, one that was not just content with the physical act of his horrific crimes, but also sought to manipulate and terrorize an entire community. Rader's pleasure in his cruel actions, his taunting letters, and the psychological torment he subjected Wichita to make the thought of this man walking free a very unsettling prospect, and one that will probably never come true, thankfully. In our number 4 spot today we have Cleophas Prince Jr. Jr. In the shadowy realm of San Diego's suburban streets lurked a menacing phantom during the 1990s. Cleophas Prince Jr., at the time known as the Claremont Killer, turned the 90s into a real-life horror show. Over 9 dreadful months he embarked on a relentless hunt, marking women as his prey in the seemingly serene Claremont neighborhood. To do this, he would either break into their homes when they least expected it, or sweet-talk them into some quiet, out-of-the-way spot. During his reign of terror, while the local news was all over it, the rest of the world hardly blinked. During this time, the stage of national and international press was captivated by other monstrous players such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, which casted a horrific shadow that eclipsed the terrifying exploits of Cleophas. Thankfully, however, in September 1990, thanks to some top-notch detective work and breakthroughs in forensic science, they finally pinned the tail on the donkey. Cleophas Prince Jr., Mr. Claremont Killer himself, got nabbed. The courts threw the book at him, and now he is chilling behind bars for the rest of his days. No parole, no second chances. In our number 3 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and the 1970s. He had a very difficult childhood, as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother, and this of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later in life. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. He is currently serving a prison sentence in Brazil and is known for his outspoken and unrepentant attitude towards his crimes. While I am sure we can all feel sympathy for the things that Pedro experienced in life, it truly is no excuse for the things that he chose to do. In our number 2 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles Ng is a name that will send chills down the spine, and he was a key player in the reign of terror that unfolded in the 1980s. Alongside his equally terrifying accomplice, Leonard Lake, Ng played a significant role in a series of crimes that remain etched into the annals of criminal history for their sheer depravity and cruelty. The grim saga began when Ng and Lake joined forces to unleash a wave of horror that would haunt their victims and the public alike. Their modus operandi was chilling. Unsuspecting individuals would be lured into their grasp only to be subjected to unimaginable torture, their final moments filled with fear and agony. What made their reign of terror even more horrifying was the duo's penchant for recording their despicable acts. These videos served as a chilling testament to their inhumanity, a grotesque spectacle of their victims suffering under their hands. Ng's role in these crimes was not that of a mere spectator. He was a very active participant, his cold-blooded nature making him a figure of dread. This, combined with his seeming indifference to the pain and suffering of his victims, made him one of the most feared inmates in the prison system. His heinous acts have left a dark stain on his name, making Charles Ng a prisoner that many pray to never see free again. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, a figure shrouded in infamy and widely recognized by his chilling moniker, the Son of Sam. He struck fear into the heart of New York City in the late 1970s. His name became synonymous with a wave of terror that swept through the city as he embarked on a series of shootings that left the public in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. Berkowitz's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were methodically planned and executed with a chilling precision that left the authorities baffled and the public on edge. Each attack added to the growing panic, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated the city. But it wasn't just his crimes that made Berkowitz a figure of terror. His claims of demonic possession added a layer of horror to his already frightening persona. These claims, whether true or the product of a deranged mind, painted a picture of a man under the influence of dark forces, making him an even more unsettling figure. The combination of his heinous crimes, alleged demonic possession, and erratic behavior made him a prisoner that one would fervently pray never walks free again. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have John George High. John George George High, commonly referred to as the acid bath killer, was an infamous English serial killer who operated in the 1940s. His gruesome crimes shocked the nation and earned him a chilling reputation for his method of disposing of the victims' bodies, which involved dissolving them in sulfuric acid. His victims included both men and women whom he targeted for their money and possessions. High would befriend his victims, gaining their trust before luring them to his place of work, a warehouse located in Crawley, West Sussex. High believed that if there were no physical remains, the police would have no evidence of his crimes. However, his assumption proved to be flawed. What a shocker. Police investigators found that while the acid effectively destroyed most of the victims' bodies, certain remains such as dentures, bone fragments, and other non-organic materials were resistant to the corrosive effects. Eventually, High's crimes caught up with him. In 1949, he was arrested for the killing of a wealthy man named Archibald Henderson, whose disappearance had raised suspicions. During his interrogation, High confessed not only to killing Henderson, but also several other individuals. At his trial, High's sanity became a significant point of contention. He claimed that he was driven by a compulsion to drink human blood and that he believed he could turn his victims' bodies into sludge, allowing him to absorb their wealth. Despite these claims, the court found High guilty and he was sentenced to death. On August 10, 1949, John George High was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison in London. In our number 9 spot today, we have Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, notorious as the Lonely Hearts Killers, were a criminal couple who operated in the late 1940s. Using various aliases and personas, Fernandez would respond to Lonely Hearts ads placed by women seeking love or companionship. He would pose as a charming, attractive man, enticing these women into romantic relationships. Beck, playing the role of Fernandez's sister or relative, would eventually join the relationship, gaining the trust of the victims. Once the couple had gained the woman's trust and manipulated them emotionally, they would proceed to rob them of their money, possessions, and even their personal savings. In some cases, the victims' bank accounts would be emptied and their properties sold off. As their greed and desperation increased, the couple turned to killing in order to eliminate any potential witnesses who could expose their criminal activities. Their crimes eventually caught up with them when they targeted a widow named Janet Fay in 1949. Fay's sister became suspicious of Fernandez's intentions and alerted the authorities. The couple was apprehended in Michigan and extradited to New York for trial. During the trial, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez confessed to multiple crimes. Both Beck and Fernandez were found guilty and sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Raymond Fernandez met the same fate on the same day. In our number 8 spot today, we have Charles Sabraj. Infamously known as the Bikini Killer or the Serpent, was a serial killer active during the 1970s who targeted and preyed upon Western tourists traveling through South Asia. He would approach them, often posing as a gem dealer or an official, guiding them through the region. Once he had gained their trust, he would employ various methods to incapacitate and then take the life of his victims. These methods included poisoning, using intoxicating substances, and sometimes even more violent physical methods. He would then rob them of their belongings, including money, passports, and any valuable possessions. Despite being arrested multiple times, he demonstrated remarkable skills in manipulating the legal systems of various countries. He often managed to escape from custody either through bribery, forging documents, or exploiting legal loopholes. However, his luck eventually ran out. In 1976, while attempting to poison a group of French students in New Delhi, he was arrested by authorities. In 1977, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in India. Over the years, he faced additional legal troubles in countries like Thailand and Nepal, which further extended his time behind bars. In our number 7 spot today, we have Gary Heidnik. This is a name you might be more familiar with than some of the others on this list, and that is because this is the man who inspired the character of Buffalo Bill in the infamous novel Silence of the Lambs. If you're familiar with the literature, you'll know that that's absolutely not a good sign. Gary Heidnik was an American serial killer who committed heinous crimes in the late 1980s. Heidnik kidnapped and tormented 6 women, imprisoning them in his home. He would lure them into his home under false pretenses, offering food, shelter, or something else that they needed or wanted. Once inside, he subjected them to unimaginable horrors, imprisoning them in a pit dug in the basement of his house house, which was later named the Pit of Horrors. Of course, I cannot detail much more of his crimes in order to stay within the guidelines of YouTube, but it's safe to say it was absolutely horrendous. Tragically, 2 of Heidnick's victims did not survive the ordeal. The remains of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay were discovered in Heidnick's basement, leading to his arrest in March 1987. The remaining 4 women were rescued and provided critical testimony against him. During his trial, Heidnick's disturbing and psychopathic behavior became very apparent. He displayed no remorse for his actions and even attempted to act as his own attorney. His behavior and erratic courtroom antics added to the shock and horror surrounding the case. Ultimately, he was found guilty of multiple counts of killing and many other charges as well. He was sentenced to death and spent several years on death row while his case went through numerous appeals. On July 6, 1999, Gary Heidnick was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institute in Rockview, Pennsylvania. In our number 6 spot today, we have Yang Xinhai. Yang, also known as the Monster Killer, was one of the most prolific serial killers in China's history. Active from 1999 to 2003, he terrorized multiple provinces by taking the lives of his victims, often targeting entire families. Yang's heinous crimes shocked the nation and left a lasting impact on Chinese society. In 1988, at the age of 20, Yang embarked on his life of crime. He was arrested and imprisoned for a series of burglaries, spending time in a labor camp. Following his release in 1999, he began a spree of violence that would terrify communities throughout China. Yang's MO involved breaking into houses during the night, often in rural areas where security was relatively lax. He would then kill the occupants, and he showed no mercy or remorse. The brutality and frequency of Yang's crimes were unprecedented in China. He showed a complete disregard for human life, often leaving behind scenes of extreme violence and horror. Despite the high number of killings, Yang managed to evade capture for several years. However, in November 2003, Yang's killing spree came to an end. During a routine police inspection, he was caught in the act of committing a burglary. When questioned by the police, Yang confessed. During his trial, he showed no remorse for his actions and appeared detached from the gravity of his crimes. He was found guilty, and in February 2004, Yang was sentenced to death and executed soon after. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and 1970s. Pedro had a difficult childhood as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother. This of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later on. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. Although he was sentenced to 400 years, there was a maximum time of 30 years, which Pedro served before being released in 2007. Pedro himself passed away earlier this year in March after being killed by 2 still unknown suspects. In our number 4 spot today, we have Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a notorious criminal and serial killer who committed a wide range of heinous acts during the early 20th century. In his own written account, Panzram claimed responsibility for 21 killings and thousands of burglaries. Throughout his criminal career, he traveled extensively, committing a slew of violent crimes along the way. This geographical dispersion made it difficult for law enforcement to connect his crimes and build a comprehensive profile of his actions. He targeted individuals who he perceived as easy victims, often taking advantage of their vulnerability or luring them into isolated areas. In 1928, Panzram was apprehended and arrested for burglary. While in prison, he authored an autobiography in which he provided a chilling first-hand account of his crimes and his deeply antisocial mindset. Panzram's writings offered a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a remorseless and violent individual. On September 5, 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. His execution marked the end of his violent reign, but his written confessions and personal accounts continue to fascinate and disturb those interested in the psychology of criminal behavior. In our number 3 spot today, we have Stephen Richards. Stephen Richards, also known by his alias Captain Moonlight, is a notorious figure in Australian criminal history. Before adopting his criminal persona, Richards pursued a career as a lay preacher in the Anglican Church. However, his actions were not in line with his religious calling. He engaged in fraudulent activities including embezzlement and insurance scams which led to his imprisonment in 1869. During his time in prison, Richards met another criminal named Jesse Nesbitt, and together they formed a bond. Upon their release in 1874, Richards and Nesbitt began leading a gang that engaged in robberies and confrontations with law enforcement. Richards adopted the moniker Captain Moonlight as his alias, and his charismatic personality garnered attention from both the public and the media. He cultivated an image of a romanticized outlaw, drawing inspiration from the legends of American Old West figures like Jesse James and Ned Kelly. In 1879, the gang attempted to rob a bank in New South Wales, resulting in a violent shootout. Several members of the gang, including Nesbitt, were killed, and Richards was captured along with the remaining members. Following their capture, Richards and his surviving gang members were put on trial for killing. The prosecution argued that Richards had ordered the shooting of a police officer during the failed bank robbery. Despite his claims of innocence, Richards was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. In the early morning hours of January 20th, 1880, Stephen Richards met his fate on the gallows at Darlinghurst Gaol in Sydney. In our number 2 spot today, we have Thomas Neill Cream. What a horrible name. So bad. Thomas Cream, dubbed the Lambeth Poisoner, was a Scottish-Canadian doctor who gained notoriety for his terrifying activities during the late 19th century. Cream's preferred method of killing was poisoning, and he targeted his victims, particularly women with whom he had been romantically involved. His crime spree started to crumble after the death of a woman named Matilda Clover, who had been his lover. Suspicion arose regarding her sudden demise, and an investigation was launched, and evidence pointed toward Cream's involvement. However, lacking concrete proof, authorities were unable to bring charges against him. Cream, undeterred, continued his killing spree, but his luck would soon run out. In 1892, Cream's crimes were exposed when he implicated himself in a series of poisonings in a bid to frame others for the killings. His actions drew attention, leading to his arrest and subsequent trial. During the trial, Cream made several erratic outbursts, including accusing others of being the true culprits, but to no avail. In October 1892, Thomas Neill Cream was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On November 15, 1892, he met his fate at Newgate Prison in London. In our number 1 spot today, we have Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei, infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized Russia for over a decade. Operating between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo was responsible for taking the lives of at least 53 people, predominantly young and vulnerable individuals. His MO typically involved approaching his victims under the pretense of offering assistance, promising them employment, or personal favors. Once he gained their trust, he would then lead them to a secluded location where the horrors would take place. In 1990, his crimes were finally brought to an end. A series of coincidences and the persistence of an investigator named Viktor Burakov led to his identification and subsequent arrest. Despite his initial denial of the crimes, DNA evidence eventually linked him to them, leading to his confession. During his trial in 1992, he was found guilty of 53 killings, although he later claimed to have killed more than 100 victims. Chikatilo was sentenced to death and executed on February 14, 1994. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Shondell Jackson. In a 2010 case, the courtroom atmosphere turned highly dramatic during the sentencing of 19-year-old Shondell Jackson. Jackson had been found guilty of the first-degree intentional killing and robbery of 21-year-old Nathan Potter, a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee student. Jackson and his accomplice, Derek Thomas, attempted to rob Potter, ultimately taking his life, even though Potter did not have any money. Throughout the trial, Jackson displayed no remorse or sadness for his crime or for the victim's death. In fact, he even smiled at the victim's family while being escorted out of the courtroom. John Potter, the victim's father, addressed Judge Rebecca Dallett during the trial, acknowledging that nothing could bring back his son, but asking for an appropriate punishment for the horrific crime. He pondered if there was such a thing as pure evil, expressing his belief that it existed. When Jackson was sentenced to life in prison without parole, his reaction turned violent as he began cursing at the judge. Prompt action by the police, who anticipated such behavior based on his actions during the trial, was required to restrain him, including the use of pepper spray. Meanwhile, members of Jackson's family seated in the back of the courtroom started hurling insults at Potter's mother after the sentencing, expressing their hatred and proclaiming that God would be the ultimate judge. Well, Not in this courtroom, but also, good luck with him. In our number 9 spot today, we have Erica Butts and Shanita Cunningham. Erica Mae Butts and Shanita Latrice Cunningham faced trial for the tragic killing of an extremely vulnerable person who was under their care. While Cunningham admitted guilt by pleading guilty, Butts opted for an Alford plea, asserting her innocence, but acknowledging the likelihood of conviction if the case went to trial. Anticipating some degree of leniency, their hopes were shattered when the judge handed down life sentences for both defendants. As the judge announced the severe sentence, Butts experienced a complete breakdown in the courtroom. Overwhelmed with emotions, she let out screams, collapsed, and began hyperventilating. Simultaneously, Cunningham fainted and had to be wheeled out of the courtroom to receive medical attention. The gravity of the situation and the weight of their sentences took an immediate toll on their composure. In our number 8 spot today, we have Manson Bryant. Manson Bryant, a career criminal found guilty of robbery, kidnapping, and an armed robbery in 2018, had an unexpected change of demeanor during his sentencing. Initially, he spoke in his defense, acknowledging the poor choices he had made, attributing them to substance abuse, and expressing his commitment to personal improvement. He even praised the justice system as a whole and expressed gratitude to the court for its decision. This is all fine and well until everything took a very sharp turn when the judge pronounced a 22-year sentence. In an instant, Bryant's demeanor shifted dramatically. He erupted in anger, unleashing a torrent of curses towards the court and hurling accusations of racism towards the judge. His outburst was prolonged, filled with numerous expletives, and in response to his behavior, the judge imposed an additional 6-year sentence as a consequence. I truly can't imagine what it would feel like to receive a prison sentence at all, let alone a very long one like that, but the response definitely did not do him any favors at all. In our number 7 spot today, we have Michael Marin. This story is unlike the others on this list today, and that is because rather than a freakout, this man did the unthinkable. Michael Marin is a man who had fallen into financial hardship and could no longer afford his mortgage payments, so he devised a desperate plan to solve his problems. After his attempt to raffle his mansion for charity failed, he resorted to arson in order to collect insurance money. When Marin was apprehended and brought to trial, he quickly realized the severity of his charges: arson and insurance fraud. The minimum sentence he faced was 7 years, but it could potentially be extended to 21 years, which, given his age of 53, essentially equated to a life sentence in his eyes. When the judge pronounced him guilty, a visible reaction of despair could be seen as Marin raised his hands to his face. However, what no one in the courtroom knew at the time was that Marin's reaction went beyond mere despair. In a shocking turn of events, he had secretly placed a cyanide capsule in his mouth and washed it down with a drink. Shortly after, he began convulsing, succumbing to the poison in full view of everyone present. In our number 6 spot today, we have Bass Webb. Bass Webb, already serving a lengthy prison sentence for the slaying of his ex-girlfriend, found himself in even deeper trouble when he committed additional offenses behind bars. Initially sentenced to 50 years for the aforementioned crime, Webb later received a life sentence for another act of the same crime, this time committed during his incarceration. However, his misdeeds did not stop there. While in jail, Webb faced charges of attempting to take the life of 2 correctional facility employees. The judge presiding over the trial had to recuse herself due to her personal acquaintance with the victims. In a shocking display of disrespect, Webb responded by spitting at the judge. As a result of this contemptible act, he received an additional 37 years added to his sentence for the aforementioned killings. Furthermore, Webb faced a separate trial for his attack on the judge. Considering the significant penalties he had already accumulated, it begs the question, what more did he have to lose? In our number 5 spot today, we have Keith Ferguson. In moments of utter despair, individuals may respond in different ways. While some may choose to accept their circumstances with composure, others, like Keith Ferguson, may exhibit a different reaction. After being found guilty of the killings of his wife and father-in-law, Ferguson received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Judge Mertz addressed Ferguson, acknowledging that while he may not fit the clinical definition of insanity, there was undeniably something fundamentally wrong with him. Mertz emphasized that Ferguson's actions, which deprived an elderly woman of her lifelong partner and 4 children of their mother solely to satisfy his own selfish desires, deserves the most severe punishment. Interrupting, Ferguson uttered the word justice, but undeterred, Judge Mertz continued, stating that justice in this case required the most significant and serious penalty. During the sentencing proceedings, Ferguson opted not to stand or raise his hand as requested. Instead, he directed profanities toward those present in the courtroom, expressing a complete disregard for the consequences. Even when removed from the room, his defiance remained evident as he proclaimed that he would see everyone there in the depths of hell. In our number 4 spot today, we have Randall Moore. Expressing remorse can often play a very significant role in mitigating a severe sentence, but for those devoid of it, redemption remains elusive. Such was the case for Randall Moore, who demonstrated no remorse for the killing of his wife and the shooting of a police officer, resulting in 3 consecutive life sentences. During the court hearing, as the victim's mother bravely delivered an impact statement, Moore callously interrupted her, using the opportunity to hurl hurtful insults. He claimed that her daughter despised her and demeaned her as a loser. Throughout the proceedings, Moore made it clear that he harbored no regrets and instead assigned blame to the victim's mother and others whom he held responsible for preventing him from seeing his son. Astonishingly, he even went as far as telling the officer he shot that he could have taken his life if he desired, asserting that he had done the officer a favor. Moore's lack of remorse and the contemptuous manner in which he addressed the victim's mother and the wounded officer offer a very chilling glimpse into the dark depths of his character. It underscores the absence of empathy and accountability, further deepening the gravity of his crimes. In our number 3 spot today, we have Jeremy Christian. The sentencing of Jeremy Christian began on a very tumultuous note as the convicted killer launched into a disturbing tirade, callously expressing regret that he hadn't killed a survivor as well. Christian's heinous act occurred in 2017 when he took the lives of 2 train passengers in Portland and attempted to kill another, ultimately leading to his conviction on 12 charges. During an impact statement in response to the victim expressing her wish for him to suffer in hell, Christian coldly retorted that he would see her there, exacerbating the tension in the courtroom. Furthermore, he proceeded to chant the name George Floyd after directing offensive remarks at the judge, further displaying his utter disregard for decorum and respect. Christian's shocking behavior during the sentencing is a stark reminder of the profound darkness that dwells within him, reflecting a complete lack of empathy and remorse for the lives he took and the pain that he inflicted upon others. He also had the worst haircut I've ever seen on a human being. It's definitely the least of his concerns, but I just couldn't move on before also mentioning that. Barber also deserves a life sentence. In our number 2 spot today, we have Michael Swanson. At the age of 18, Michael Swanson faced trial for the horrific act of taking the lives of 2 people. His criminal rampage began with the merciless killing of a store clerk during a robbery and was tragically repeated at another location. Shockingly, when Swanson was convicted of his heinous crimes, he responded with laughter, displaying a disturbing lack of remorse. During the sentencing proceedings, as the judge delivered the verdict of life imprisonment, a disconcerting smile spread across Swanson's face. Despite the judge's stern warning of potentially extending his sentence, it is uncertain whether such a threat held significant weight given Swanson's apparent detachment and just disregard for the severity of his actions. The chilling demeanor exhibited by Swanson throughout the trial and sentencing unveils a deeply troubled individual who seemingly finds amusement in the suffering he has caused. The profound absence of remorse only serves to emphasize the gravity of his crimes and the tragic loss experienced by the victims and their family. In our number 1 spot today, we have Bryce Rhodes. This is someone who has had multiple outbursts during different court proceedings and someone who often appears to be troublesome in the courtroom. During one of the trials of Bryce Rhodes, who was charged with a triple homicide, his behavior as a defendant was characterized by anger, erraticism, and confusion. Despite facing the possibility of the death penalty or life imprisonment, Rhodes displayed a surprising lack of distress. Throughout the court proceedings, Rhodes repeatedly disrupted them with his outbursts. He made unfounded accusations, such as accusing the judge of belonging to a white supremacy group, and in a particularly disturbing act, Rhodes even spit on one of the lawyers involved in the case. He fired his lawyers, made nonsensical statements, and callously mocked the families of his victims by smiling at them. Rhodes' defense attorney argued that he required a competency test, suggesting that his behavior was indicative of mental health issues. However, the families of the victims viewed this as a mere ploy to waste time and delay justice.